When it comes to linking developmental processes to classical Darwinian selection, we find that there is a disconnect between the description of the final shape, form, and capabilities of the developed individual, and the concerted actions of the cellular mechanisms that reproduce that complex organization in each generation. Drawing a distinction between ecological and generative phenotypes. For this reason, I propose that we recognize the distinction between the phenotypic gestalt of the fully developed individual and the cellular mechanisms and toolkits that generate that phenotypic gestalt. To help clarify this distinction, I suggest that we refer to the phenotypic gestalt, the integrated product of development, as the ecological phenotype, and the molecular, cellular, and developmental determinants of that phenotype as the generative phenotype. Why Darwin focused on the ecological phenotype. Darwin was naturally focused on the ecological phenotype rather than the generative phenotype because molecular, cellular, and developmental biology had not yet come of age. This begs the following question: at what level does natural selection act? Does it act on the ecological phenotype, the generative phenotype, or both? Clearly, natural selection must act on the products of development. That is, the capabilities and adaptations of developed individuals that adapt them to a particular way of life or niche, but also must act on the generative processes that organize the multicellular individual and that can lead to distinctions in their complex shapes, forms, and capabilities. Unlike the ecological phenotype, the generative phenotype refers to both EEP, Chapter 2, and SSM-IBE, Chapter 12, and the ways that the metaphorical blind watchmaking, tinkering, Rube Goldberg machines, genomic scrapyards and developmental toolkits, black boxes, opportunism, and trial and error, Chapter 13, link genetic determinants to the reproduction of complex organization. The short-term selection of the ecological phenotype is a real-time generational phenomenon. The ecological phenotype determines the fitness of each individual during its lifetime, its ability to survive and reproduce its own kind in a particular environmental niche. The ecological phenotype of each individual is under selective pressure that is determined by interactions with its particular environmental circumstances. This selective pressure involves actual real-time events that take place throughout its lifetime. This is the relatively short-term time frame of selection that takes place in each generation. But selection is not limited to the real-time ecological events that affect the life of the individual and its ability to reproduce its own kind. Selection also acts upon the generative genetic determinants responsible for multicellular biological organization. The long-term selection of the generative phenotype transcends generations and therefore transcends time and space. Selection also acts in a long-term way on each lineage. Each individual that has ever lived has a chain of ancestry consisting of both ancestors and descendants, unless it has gone extinct. Sometimes genetic information may also be shared via horizontal gene transfer, in addition to active protein coding and/or regulatory DNA sequences that are transferred from generation to generation. A larger set of DNA sequences, the genomic scrapyard, is also transferred. Developmental determinants, toolkit elements described by evolutionary developmental biologists, are also transferred. These DNA sequences and toolkit elements have enormous EEP that affect the long-term capabilities, adaptations, and survival of every lineage. Often, developmental toolkit elements exhibit deep homology, highly conserved elements that are shared by even distantly related species and that are often deployed in novel ways. This topic is further discussed in Chapter 15. The long-term survival of any lineage depends on the availability, flexibility, robustness, and efficacy of the generative phenotype. Long-term capabilities and survival, in other words, depend on the evolvability, and a big part of the evolvability contributed by the genomic scrapyard and redeployment of developmental toolkit components can be attributed to the generative phenotype. The evolutionary significance of the generative phenotype involves EEP and transcends the real-time selective pressures on individuals and extends over a multitude of generations.